Hello, welcome to Election Day training. This training has been created for election officials scheduled to work at the November 3rd, 2020 general election. I'm Janice Moyer, Village Clerk for the Village of Menomonee Falls. Today's training will be presented by myself and Deputy Clerk Amy Vanderhei. Election Day notes. Election officials may not wear political apparel or discuss candidates or politics while working at the polling place. Please report any violation of this to the Chief Inspector. I want to emphasize that as much media coverage and all the flurry of activity regarding all the political situations out there, whether it's talking about how secure ballots are or candidates, anything like that, you really need to refrain from that at the polling place. Just a piece of a discussion can be overheard by a voter, and they may think it's something else, or you may offend someone else. So please make sure that you are not having any of those types of discussions. If you have questions about any of that, please contact me ahead of the election, and I would be happy to have a discussion with you about that. I want to mention the state mandates for the state of Wisconsin. Right now, face coverings are required and 6-foot distancing when possible. All election officials working on election day must wear a face covering and maintain 6-foot distancing when possible. The village will provide masks if needed. And we did send an email out to everyone who's working for us to ask if you wanted a face shield. If you responded and said you did, we have those available, and we will have those ready to issue to you at the polling place on election day. If you wish to vote and do not work at your specified polling location, you may vote by absentee, either by mail or in the clerk services office. Right now, we are already doing in-person absentee voting, and we will be doing that through the 30th of October. If you need information on that, you can go to the village's webpage, and we have information on our hours and when you can come in to in-person absentee vote. You can still request an absentee by mail also. If you do request one by mail, make sure you complete it timely and either put it in the mail, drop it in one of the drop boxes, or bring it into clerk services. I want to talk a little bit about absentee ballot drop-off and central count. Because of the large numbers of absentee voting that's going on for this election and has been this year for all the elections, we are doing central count for processing and counting of absentee ballots. So that means that all of the ballots go to one location. For this particular election, we are using the gray gym at the Menomonee Falls High School. If you are working at a polling place, this really doesn't pertain to you. For our central count people who are listening to this, that is the location where we will be doing the central count of all of our absentee ballots. On election day, completed absentee ballots will not be accepted at polling locations. In the past, we have done that. The problem we run into is trying to do the behind the scenes processing so that those ballots can be opened timely. We have a lot of pressure on us to make sure that we get all those absentee ballots opened fairly close to 8 o'clock or shortly thereafter. And when people drop those ballots off at polling locations, that does delay that. And then there is transporting of those ballots also. So what do you do with that? We are going to have a handout that we're going to provide. We will have police aides at all 3 of our two polling locations, Davians and at Good Shepherd Church. And they will have a handout that they can give to a voter that will give them information on where they can drop their ballots off. So that should help with that situation. I want to talk a little bit about reviewing photo ID, and Amy's going to take that slide.
So reviewing photo ID is for when you're sitting at the poll book table and a voter comes up to vote and they need to show you their photo ID to be able to receive a ballot. So this is a slide we use, and you may have seen it before for our veteran officials. So you're going to be looking at the photo ID for the elector's photograph. The photo must reasonably resemble the elector, but keep in mind that appearances may change over the years. We do understand that people are now going to be wearing masks and face coverings. We do not ask that you have them take it off. Just look and see as much of the face as you can see. You'll know if something is really off. You're also looking for the elector's name. The elector's name must conform to the name on their voter registration, but it does not have to be identical. So something as a Robert and Bob, a William and Will, or Bill, anything like that is completely acceptable. You're also looking at the expiration date. If the ID has been expired, it has to be expired meeting the expiration deadlines. So it has to be expired on or after 11/6/2018. A few reminders is that the photo ID does not have to include the current address. With the state of Wisconsin, you do not have to get a completely new photo ID to have your change of address. You can just update it with the DMV, and then the next time you need a new license when it's expired, they'll give you a new one. The voter signature does not have to be on the photo ID either. This next slide is more proof of identification. So this goes into a little bit of explaining exactly what is acceptable and what is not. So we're going to list some of these things and you can read it more in depth on your own. So the proof of Wisconsin ID would include a state of Wisconsin driver's license or instructional permit, again with the expiration date unexpired or expired after 11/6/2018, a state of Wisconsin identification card, military ID card issued by the U.S. Uniformed Services, a military ID card issued by a veteran to a veteran by the U.S. Uniformed Services, a Veterans Affairs ID card, which this does not have to be expired. There is no expiration date. The photo ID card issued by a Wisconsin accredited university or college or technical college. So there has to be a date of card issuance on the card. There has to be a signature of the student, and it has to be expired no later than 2 years after the date of issuance. Also, they have to provide a document of enrollment, a tuition fee receipt, verification letter, or class schedule for a photo identification for a college or technical college to be accepted. A U.S. passport or booklet card, certificate of naturalization, Wisconsin DOT driving receipt. So if they haven't gotten their ID yet, but they have the receipt, that is also acceptable. An ID card issued by a federally recognized Wisconsin tribe, the Wisconsin ID petition process photo receipt, or a citation or notice of revoked or suspended Wisconsin driver's license, or a state of Wisconsin identification card with no photograph. This next slide we included because this is what you're going to have on election day. This is going to be in front of the poll book. So when somebody comes up to you to show you their photo identification, if it is something not accepted on this piece of paper, please see your chief inspector. They'll have more information on if something is acceptable or not, but these are more of the generalized ones you're going to see on election day. This next page, we're going to talk about what's actually in the poll book and the notations you may see. So this is a sample page of the poll book. And the very top, you're going to see a yellow highlighted absentee return. Yes, they will be upside down because it's for the voter to read. And on the very bottom, you're going to see an absentee issued. So there's differences between these two, and we're going to talk about them more on the next page. Okay, so let's talk about these poll book notations. So if the poll book has a notation, we're going to talk about what you do. So if it has a notation of absentee issued, first you're going to check an absentee ballot log to see if the ballot has been returned. There will be a date in the column of a ballot returned. When you start the day, you're going to have a log that shows any absentee ballot returned to the clerk's office before election day. These are all the ones that we have checked in and made sure we have ready for our processors to start at the beginning of the day. So you look in the log and it doesn't say it's returned, the next thing to do is ask the voter if they have returned their absentee ballot. This can be either by delivering it to the clerk services, one of our drop-off locations, or by the mail. If the voter has returned their ballot, they cannot vote. If the voter has not returned their ballot, they are able to vote. I'd like to talk about this a little bit more. What does it really mean when we say returned a ballot? If somebody puts their ballot into the mail stream, so you ask them, have they put their ballot into the mail yet to return their ballot? If they say yes, that is considered a returned ballot. If they say yes, that they have put it in the drop box, but it does not show on our log, so like they've done it on election day, that is considered returned. And same as if they've dropped it at our office, that is considered returned, even if it is not on our absentee ballot log. So if the voter states that they have not returned their ballot, or that they have, if the voter states they did not return the ballot, please check with the chief inspector who will verify that there was nothing returned. As ballots are coming into our office on election day or to our central count, we are going to be checking them into the Wisconsin state database. So our chief inspectors are going to be able to see in time what ballots have been returned and when. So what if the notation states an absentee returned? If the voter has an absentee returned, they are not able to vote. This means that we have received their ballot by clerk services before the date we print our poll books. So what do you do if the voter states that they did not return their ballot, but it says absentee returned? Please do not turn this voter away. Please check with our chief inspector. They're going to be able to talk to the voter and figure out what really happened. They're going to be in contact with clerk services to see when the ballot was returned and checking with our central count facility.
The next slide has the sample ballot. We have two ballot styles for this election. The reason being we have two state assembly districts that have candidates for the November election. The first ballot on page 9 is a sample ballot for anyone who resides in wards 1 through 4 or 10 through 23, and that's State Assembly District 22. I know this is kind of a small slide to see. What I would suggest is that you go to your go to myvote.wi.gov, and as a voter, you can go and see actually the candidates that will be on your ballot. You're not going to see a snapshot of the ballot like you do in the PowerPoint, but you can at least see the candidates. On slide 10 is the sample ballot for wards 5 through 9, and that has State Assembly District 24. Other than the state assembly districts, all the other contests are identical on both ballots. So when you're working at one of the polling places, make sure you're giving your voter the correct ballot, and you should only have your ward ballots by your ward table. So if you're working on Ward 1, you should only have Ward 1 ballots. We will have a supply for you at the table. If for some reason you still need to review the ballot, make sure it's the right ward. If for some reason there's a pack that got mixed up with yours from a different ward, by all means, let us know, let the chief inspector know so that we can move those around. We have over 30,000 ballots in our possession right now. And after absentee voting, we'll still probably have at least half of those. And so sometimes those packs of ballots can get a little mixed up. We try our hardest, but sometimes that happens. So just be aware that you should always be looking at the ward number and on your ballot. So when we go to slide 11, that's where you actually see the ward number. If you look at this sample of the back of the ballot, or what I call the endorsement area, you can see where the green area is that it has the date of the election. It has Ward 5, which was just the one that I grabbed for the PowerPoint. So that's where you would look for the ward number. The next section where I have the arrow is ballots issued by, and that is where the two poll workers who are at that poll list table both need to initial. You're not doing a signature, you're just doing initials. So your first initial, last initial, and we need to have two people for every ballot. That makes it a live ballot and a valid ballot so that the voter can vote it. One other thing I also want to note is if you go about halfway down on the endorsement area, there is a signature of a sister. Someone who would have trouble voting a ballot can be assisted. Typically, if you're at a poll list table, you wouldn't be doing that. A chief inspector might, but just so you're aware of that. Someone who can't see real well, may have dexterity issues. They have to be able to tell the assister who they want to vote for, but someone else can mark the ballot on their behalf. And then that person would sign on that location. A notation would also be made in the poll book that there was an assister. There is more information on that in the poll book video. The next slide is about overvoted ballots. And obviously this is from an old election, actually from 2016. But it's a good example of what happens when someone overvotes a ballot. In this case, there was a US state senator contest and the voter voted for 2 and it says vote for 1. So the instructions say vote for 1, the voter voted for 2. That's what we call an overvote. The other snippet on this slide is what the screen looks like on the voting equipment when a voter puts the ballot in the machine and they have overvoted. It tells them actually which contest, and it says you chose 2 candidates and you're only allowed to choose 1. So in this case, the ballot would be returned. You can see the return button, and then that voter could get a clean ballot, and then they could vote again. Voters can get 3 tries at the polls, so if they go through a 3rd ballot, then they can't vote. I've only had that happen once, but it can happen. Anyway, this is the ballot for this election's a pretty easy ballot. I don't think there'll be too much of that, but just in case, so you're aware. The next slide is about the free ID and identification card petition process, which we call IDPP. And this is something that we have to make available to voters who may not have an ID. If there's someone that walks up to your poll list table where you're working, they do not have any of the ID that Amy mentioned in the prior slides, they need to be given this sheet. And actually we have copies of this exact sheet in the cases of paperwork that we send out to the polling places. You would go to the chief inspector and let them give the person this sheet so that they know how they can get a free ID for voting if need be. So slide 14 is a little bit about voter registration and presidential only ballots. A voter must have lived at their current address in the village at least 28 days before the election. So for this particular election, that is on or before October 6th, 2020. If they moved into their new residence on October 6th, they're fine. If they moved and they can vote here, if they moved into their residence on October 7th, then they are not able to vote at the polling place that they're at for their new residence. So what do we do with that? If they cannot vote at their polling place because they can't meet the residency requirement, then they would go to where they previously lived to vote. And that could be just a different ward, which means they may have to go to a different polling place. They could be at moved into Ward 5, and they did live in Ward 20. Well, that means that they would go back to Davians to vote. So even if they moved from one place in the village to another, you still need to make sure they're voting at the right polling place. It can make a difference as far as the ballot they get. Again, we have those 2 assembly districts. So we want them to vote for the candidate that they're eligible to vote for. Voters moving to Wisconsin from another state and do not qualify to vote in their new residence may be eligible to receive a presidential only ballot. And I'm going to meet with the chief inspectors next week. We're going to go over a little bit about presidential only ballots, but this is good for you to know, just in case you would have someone who would be in their new residence and they need to vote a presidential only ballot. Residents passing through or here temporarily must vote in their home state or their home community, and they are not eligible for a presidential only ballot.
I'm going to talk about a few scenarios of when somebody would need to re-register and where they would need to vote at. So scenario number 1, the voter has moved from one ward to another in the same municipality at least 28 consecutive days before the election. So the voter would need to vote in their new ward and they would need to be re-registered. Scenario number 2, the voter has moved from one municipality to another at least 28 consecutive days before an election. The voter will need to re-register at their new municipality and vote there. The voter has moved from one ward to another in the same municipality less than 28 consecutive days before the election. They would vote where they were previously registered. They wouldn't be re-registering because they did not meet the residency requirement. So they would be voting here in Menominee Falls at their old ward. The voter has moved from one municipality to another less than 28 days. They would not be voting here in Menominee Falls. You would have to tell them to return to their previous municipality to vote. If a voter has moved to a different ward or state temporarily with intent to return, they would vote in the ward from which they have moved from, so the place of their residency. Lives in one ward or municipality and conducts business in another, again, they have to vote in their ward of residency or their municipality of residency where they live. So if somebody lives in a public or private facility, such as a federal or state institution, county home or hospital, nursing home or group home, they would vote in the municipality where the facility is located or in the municipality of residence before entering the facility. So we're going to talk about provisional voting. There are 2 reasons only for somebody to receive a provisional ballot. If a voter fails to provide an acceptable form of photo ID when they're at the poll book table, you can refer them then to the chief inspector. Or if a voter is registering to vote, has a current and valid Wisconsin driver's license or Wisconsin ID, but is unwilling or unable to provide the card number. So they're registering to vote. They only have their passport with them to show for proof of identification, but they cannot give you their Wisconsin driver's license number, which they do currently have. Again, you would refer them to the chief inspector. Note that for when they're registering, if they have a valid state Wisconsin driver's license or ID, they cannot just alternatively use their social security number. They have to give their driver's license number. So like I stated, any person who does not have their photo ID or their driver's license number, please refer them to the chief inspector. The chief inspector has been trained to complete all provisional voting processes.
Ballots. End of the day, ballot bagging. Poll workers need to look at ballots for write-in votes before bagging them. Ballots will be bagged by machine, and any party represented poll workers must sign the ballot bags. The party represented poll workers would be one of the 2 major parties who have appointed those people, and the chief inspectors know who those individuals are and will make sure that they are part of that process. The ballot bag seal numbers will be written on each inspector's statement, and ballots do not need to be bagged by ward anymore. They can be commingled, and that saves a lot of time at the end of the day. Please make sure you use multiple bags and do not fill them too full. I was told at the August election, some of the bags were way too full. So err on the side of them being a little bit less full than more full. That will help us with our processing. The next page, page 18, I've listed the registered write-in candidates for the 2020 election. This was as of October 16th, when I looked on the state's website. This is what they had. You can see there are 6 write-in candidates. So when you are bagging ballots, these are the candidates you may be looking for. What I would suggest is as you go through the ballots at the end of the night, anything that has a write-in notation, a name written in a write-in area, set those to the side, and then you can look at those later. And we do not give that write-in information to voters. If they come in and they ask who a write-in candidate is, they can go to the Wisconsin Election Commission's website, and right on their front page, they can get to the list of registered write-ins. You are not required to be able to provide those or have a list to hand out. That would be up to them to determine. So let's talk a little bit about observers. We will have observers at this election. We haven't had them for a while, but we will have them. I've been meeting with the chief inspectors next week, and we will be spending quite a bit of time talking about observers, but just so you're aware, people who want to come in and watch what's going on can do that. Observers only communicate with chief inspectors. If you have an observer that may be watching you at a poll list table and they're trying to talk to you, you need to ask them to contact the chief inspector. They're not supposed to be taking you away from your duties, and you're supposed to be focusing on what we're asking you to do, not a question from an observer. We will designate observer areas. The guidance from the Wisconsin Election Commission is 3 feet to 8 feet from, they can either be observing a poll list table or a registration table. Because of social distancing, we will make sure that they are 6 feet away, which will probably create some issues for them because they usually like to hear what's going on. But with the pandemic and the state mandates and all the things we're trying to do to keep you safe, we would ask that they would be 6 feet away, and they will also have to wear masks or a face covering while they are in the polling place. If they do not bring one with them, we will have some to provide to them. Observers cannot handle the poll list or other official election documents. Observers may silently use their cell phones in the polling place. They should not be making voice calls. Ringers must be silenced. They may not take photographs or videos in the polling place. The chief inspector will complete a form, and then they will ask the observer to provide photo ID, and they should be wearing a name tag so that voters don't mistake them for a poll worker. Observers must be warned about any disruptive behavior. If you're having issues with that, please contact your chief inspector. Do not let it go. Wait, I don't want any situations where we've got someone who's being disruptive and creating problems for you. If the observer is asked, or if the behavior continues, an observer could be asked to leave, and the chief inspector would take care of that. Let's talk a little bit about media. Media must check in with the chief inspector. We probably will have some media at our polling places. The chief inspector will document that on their inspector statement. They cannot use video equipment to record how a voter has voted. And if they do want to contact voters, it should be limited. I always ask them to do it outside the polling place after people have voted. And if they want to talk to a reporter, that's fine. If they don't, then they can go on their way. Like I said, interviews should be held outside of the voting area. They shouldn't be doing interviews inside the polling place, basically. So one of the last slides we have is on voters using cell phones. This is some guidance that has changed with the way technology is right now and over time. At first, nobody could use a cell phone in a polling place, and that guidance has changed. So I want to go over that with you. A voter can take a photo of their ballot, and that used to be a no, but now they can do that. The standard is that photos are acceptable provided that the act of taking the photo doesn't cause a disturbance or capture how other voters are marking their ballots. It is still illegal in Wisconsin to share the contents of one's voted ballot, either in person or via social media. But the act of taking the photo is not illegal. So that gets a little confusing at times. So they can take the picture, but they can't share it. That's basically it. A voter can take a photo of themselves inserting their ballot in the voting equipment as long as they are not capturing how any other voter has marked their ballot, or if they are not holding up the line or creating a disturbance. We've had people taking pictures of themselves putting their absentee ballots in our absentee ballot drop boxes. And so this is something we haven't really touched on before, but I wanted to make sure you were prepared in case someone does want to do that. Anyone who wants to photograph a voter should do that outside the voting area. An example would be a first-time voter, and I know people are excited to vote, and we're so happy for that. Sometimes, someone wants to have a picture of them doing their, voting for the first time. We have vote here signs, there's a number of signs they could take their picture by. So that should be sufficient for those first-time voters or anybody who wants to have a picture to remember their voting experience. So just a little bit of other important information. Remember, voters cannot be required to wear a face covering because there's not a federal mandate. This is a federal election, and because there is no federal mandate, we cannot require the voters to wear a face covering. But election officials, it doesn't matter if you're a registration person at a polis table, the chief inspectors need to wear face coverings. Again, a voter cannot be required. We cannot turn someone away because they don't have a face covering. And then also, I always encourage you to review the emergency response plan before each election day, just in case we would have an emergency, you would know what to do and you could be helpful in that situation. This concludes the training, and I would like to thank you for listening.